Well, Karen, first of all, thanks for finding the time to talk with us here. I've been reading your book, The Great Transformation, and I had a couple of thoughts while reading it. One is that Karen Armstrong has come a long way since she was a nun. You were in a convent in your early 20s. And this book, although it's certainly relevant to Christianity, it's much broader in scope. It's about a formative period in the history of the great spiritual traditions around the world: Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and also as well the Abrahamic tradition. But the other thought I had was that there's a certain sense in which you're staying true to your original vocation, in the sense that although you're not kind of preaching the Christian gospel here, and although it's really it's not a preachy book at all, there is a kind of gospel in the original sense of the word, of good and timely and important news that you're trying to bring here, right? Not the gospel of John, but
the gospel of compassion, I would say. And I think that one of the most noticeable things about this period of history, when in 4 distinct corners of the world the great traditions that have continued to nourish humanity came into being, they all stressed the essential virtue of compassion, not just as a test of religiosity, but as the means to get to what people have called God or Brahman, Nirvana or the Tao. That by dethroning yourself from the center of your world and putting another there, you experience the transcendence that we're all seeking throughout our lives.
And I would say it's a particularly important time for people to seek it, in your view, right?
I think so. This is a time, first of all, when the world seems polarized again. And a lot of this polarization has a religious covering. Religion has been implicated in some of the worst and most cruel atrocities of our time. And so it's very important to see, A, what the great traditions worldwide share and how deeply similar they are. But secondly, this call to compassion, and above all, to have concern for everybody. This is something that all these traditions, whether it's Confucianism, Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and later the monotheism, stressed, was that it was not enough to feel compassion and loyalty to your own immediate group, to congenial people, but that you had to extend your sympathies to every single creature on the face of the planet. Have, as the Chinese philosopher Mozi said, Jan Ai, concern for everybody. And that is essential at this point in history, when we're bound together as never before by electronically, economically, politically, that unless we learn to have concern for everybody, I doubt if we're going to make it through another 100 years.
And it seems that message in its strong form, boundless compassion, was actually more explicit in the Eastern traditions. That's the impression I get from your book, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I would. I think the monotheism in Israel developed, but in fits and bounds. And sometimes you see this progress in the Bible. You see a movement towards compassion and towards absolute respect for the other. You get it in some of the stories in Genesis. You get it particularly in the priestly writers, in Leviticus and Numbers.
That's where love your neighbor as yourself.
Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the stranger. If a stranger lives with you in your land, do not molest him. Says the priestly author. You must treat him as one of your own people and love him as yourself, for you were once strangers in Egypt. But then there are also, as we know, really violent passages in both the Old Testament or the Jewish scriptures and the New Testament, where the axial virtues of non-violence and compassion for everybody is replaced. It shows how, I think the testimony of the Bible shows our struggle towards this difficult ideal, that it's there, but we retreat from it. Now in Greece, the other axial age people, they had marvelous movements towards compassion. I think particularly in the tragic drama, which was, of course, part of a religious festival in honor of Dionysus, where the great tragedians in the 5th century, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, all put suffering on stage and showed the audience the anatomy of suffering and urged the audience to weep for people such as Oedipus, a man who had killed his father, married his mother, Heracles, who in a fit of divinely inspired madness had killed his wife and children. And these hopelessly polluted people whom you shun in normal life, you were told to extend your sympathies to them. But then also Greece also withdrew from that ideal of compassion too, and it never eschewed violence. And Athens was may have been democratic, but it was a very cruel place.
And in general, I think you say in the book that you're tracing the thought of elites or intellectuals of the day.
Yes.
We in a lot of cases don't have a very good record of what was actually going on the ground.
No.
So you're not necessarily saying life was better then,
but
no. You're talking about when some particularly valuable ideas seem to have taken shape.
Yes, the axial sages were so much in advance of their time that most of their contemporaries couldn't follow them. These were geniuses, and their demand was huge. Now, the same pertains today, of course. Not many people really want to be absolutely transformed by religion. Many want to go along, say, to church or to synagogue or to mosque, get a sort of mild ethical uplift once a week, and then they return to their normal lives. Now, the axial sages, Confucius, Buddha, Socrates, they wanted an enhanced humanity. They wanted to be absolutely transformed, and not many people could follow them there. Nevertheless, they made a profound impression, and we still see these people as luminaries today. People in later ages continue to turn back to these people at this pivotal moment of spiritual history.
And I think it's your belief that these ideas emerged at the time in response to circumstances, in some cases like circumstances today, right?
Yes, I mean, all these traditions developed in societies like our own that were rent apart by violence as never before. Of course, the violence seems puny compared with what we face today. But iron weaponry had been discovered. This was the Iron Age, and iron weapons made wars far more deadly and frightening and dangerous.
It was a weapon of mass destruction in its day.
In its day, it was a weapon of mass destruction. Kingdoms were developing that depended upon force, coercion, police force, armies to keep the people in line. Market economies were developing with a very aggressive mercantile infant capitalism burgeoning. And every single one of these major traditions began in recoil from that violence. Every single one began with an attempt to give up the violence of their time, and in doing so, they began to discover the inner world when they started to look within for the causes of violence in the human psyche.
Okay. Now, it seems to me that one thing you're also interested in doing, I mean, okay, so there's that kind of relevance to the modern era. Seems to me you're also looking at people who developed a vocabulary that could serve as the basis for a modern spirituality in the sense of the scientific age. In other words, of course, the norm of actual religious practice in those days, probably everywhere roughly, was to think in terms of gods, anthropomorphic gods, and I think so far as we know that's largely what was going on the ground. But you're looking at thinkers who begin to talk about the divine in less anthropomorphic terms, to use more abstract kind of metaphysical terminology, to talk about spiritual goals and so on, right? So am I?
Yes, you're absolutely right, particularly again in the East. that you have in India, the old gods lost their appeal. Gods such as Indra, god of war, Agni, god of fire, and they became spiritualized. They became symbolic of various states of mind. Some of them were even demoted to human status. You have in the Upanishads a story of the great god Indra, who comes down to earth and lives as a humble Vedic student and has to learn, like human beings, to find enlightenment. He depends upon a guru, a good teacher. The Buddha was not interested in gods and seems to have seen the gods as a sort of aspects of his own states of mind sometimes. In China, Confucius was really uninterested in the divine. He told his followers not to ask questions about the supernatural. What was the point of that when we couldn't even understand what was going on earth? And even in the Bible, you have a movement towards a more transcendent notion of God. The God of ancient Israel was a god of war, highly tribal, particularistic, and astonishing as it may seem, this God would ultimately become a symbol of compassion, so that you have in the 6th century, the prophet we know as second Isaiah saying, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways not your ways. As high as heaven is above the earth, so are my thoughts above your thoughts." So you have a move towards transcendence there, that God can't be seen in these simple anthropomorphic terms. And that is helpful for people today. Very often, people today, we often hear about God for the first time when we're very little, at the same time as we're learning about Santa Claus. And our idea of Santa Claus develops and changes over the years, but some people's idea of God gets stuck. And so, of course, they reject this highly anthropomorphized God and don't realize that, of course, that God has to develop and grow in your mind too as you mature.
Okay, on this idea of the evolution of ideas of God as something other than a person, or an animal with a person's mind, or whatever, one question I have is, how far toward abstraction can your conception of God move and still be meaningful? I mean, as a motivator, and still be attractive to people?
I think one of the great characteristics of this age of spirituality is that as the notion of the absolute became more ethereal, as it were, more otherworldly, they also discovered the divine in themselves. In India, Brahman was the foundation of everything that existed. It was utter transcendence, but it was also identical with your very deepest self, with your Atman. In Buddhism, nirvana is not a place or distant object. It is also a sacred realm of peace that you discover in the core of your being, absolutely natural to humanity. And the Chinese never really had an idea of a transcendent divine. They sought the sacred in this earth. And similarly, this would develop in the monotheistic traditions too, that you would see in the mystics, whether they're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, years after the Axial Age, would discover what they call God in the depths of their self. And some Muslim mystics would say that when I encountered God, thou art thou, but you're also me. Mm-hmm. That the two are one. So if God becomes too abstract, too remote, then those gods tend to die. And I think that's what's happened to God for some people today, that God has certainly, perhaps not so much in this country, which is very religious, but in Europe or Britain, my own country, God has become so abstract and incredible that he has died on people.
Well, yeah, I mean, when modern theologians say things like Paul Tillich said, God is the ground of being, I mean, a lot of people go, well, I'm sorry, but that doesn't do anything for me.
You have to find it, and I think the quest is I think what the axial age, this age that I'm writing about, was saying was that it's the process that brings you intimations of compassion and ecstasy. That it's not a question of sitting down saying, right, there's a God, he's out there, I'm going to find him. It's a question of entering the way. In China, the ultimate value is often called the Tao, the way. It is the actual living a life of Ren, of compassion, that gives you transcendence. And so I think in this period, I found that when people concentrated too much on what they were going to transcend to, i.e. defining God, or what is God, or is God one, or they tended to lose it a bit. When, however, they concentrated on what they were transcending from, that is greed, egotism, cruelty, suffering, then they and didn't worry so much where they were going. That brought them intimations of something greater than themselves.
Right, but you recognize the hunger on a part of a lot of people. Maybe it's more Westerners than Easterners, I don't know. But
yes.
To have, if not a clear conception of what God is like, a strong conviction that there is something out there that is a source of meaning, that gives guidance in some sense, that imbues their life with purpose in some sense.
I think this is a perfectly fine idea of God. I have no problem with it. It has satisfied many people, as you say, particularly in the West. Interestingly, not so much in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which has a more Buddhist conception of the divine, I think, and certainly a more Buddhist conception of Jesus. But I think that's fine, but it's only one conception of the divine, and we can never say that we have got the handle on God or nirvana, because then you've cut it down to size and said, you know, right, I've got God in my pocket. This, I know exactly what God is. You're defining a word that literally means to set limits upon something. And so if your idea of God give, you know, it, as an external creator who is providentially guiding the world and to whom you can speak in prayer, if that gives you a sense that life has meaning and value and impels you to act in a compassionate way, then that is a fine notion of the divine. But other people find that notion of God increasingly incredible, and they shouldn't be discouraged, because there are other ways of envisaging the illimitable, ineffable, indescribable God.
Okay. Now, I once heard an interviewer try to pin you down on your religious beliefs, and they were not very successful. Because you don't like to talk in terms of belief. You said you think belief is a red herring, and you said that kind of what you just said. I mean, the important thing is practical behavior, the acts of compassion. But you didn't just mean that that's the ultimate judge, that's the ultimate gauge of your spiritual life. You also suggested that that is compassion and a very purposeful attempt to put yourself in the shoes of other people is a portal to some, well, you sometimes use the word dimension, the transcendent. I mean, let me read. Here's what you say this in the context of Confucianism, but I think I think you're buying into it. You say living a compassionate, empathic life took you beyond yourself and introduced you into another dimension.
Yes. A
sacred reality that was both immanent and transcendent. So, I mean, you do believe, you're not just using dimension metaphorically.
No, and this is not my idea.
But I actually, at the moment, I'm asking about your ideas.
Yeah, what I've found from my own experience and from studying these people is that for me, the practice is more important than metaphysical conviction. And the Buddha, I'm delighted to say, would agree with me, and Confucius also. And the prophets of Israel, or Jesus, weren't very keen on metaphysical descriptions of God. What they're all talking about is doing things, behaving in a way that changes you profoundly. And in the course of that behavior, especially compassionate behavior, you encounter another transcendent reality, an ecstasis. The Greek word ecstasis means stepping outside, where you step outside the boundaries of yourself and you encounter something else.
So you're at least saying there is a transcendent reality.
Oh, transcendence has been a fact of human life. This is how we are as human beings, and we all seek to access it one way and another.
You mean transcending our mundane, egoistic perspective?
Yes, and that gives you a sense that life has, despite the incredibly depressing evidence to the contrary, some ultimate value and significance. That's a heroic endeavor to make yourself believe that, or to be convinced of it. But it's a different kind of knowledge from the kind of knowledge that you get from a computer, or clicking and getting information online, or learning about a battle of, the Battle of Waterloo, for example, or about the existence of a distant planet.
So you think there is, in some sense, a transcendent source of meaning, or a transcendent kind of truth kind of out there that we can access?
I would put it this way. I would say that for human beings, transcendence is part of our experience of the world. And you can talk about this in many, many different ways. But that human beings have found that in order to be fully human, or fully humane, as Confucius might have said, you need to encounter this transcendence, which is not just out there, but it's here too. It's here within.
Yeah, let me tell you about an experience I've had a few times that seemed kind of transcendent. And it tends to happen in places like train stations, where there are a lot of different kinds of people. And it's not an out-of-body experience, but it's kind of an out-of-ego experience. I think it's in this book that you make the point that we typically evaluate other people in terms of their relation to our interests. You know, he's a threat, he could be an ally, she's attractive, that guy, you know, keep an eye on that, and so on. And that's the way we go through life, especially at places like train stations. But every once in a while I get this sense, I just am not looking at people that way, and I'm realizing that they're exactly like me fundamentally, in the sense that in the sense that they're doing that, kind of. In other words, the sense that we're all kind of going through the world with a very kind of constrained perspective, and that's life, and we all have insecurities, and we're all ultimately very vulnerable. But I mean, it's one thing to describe this, but I mean, when I have the experience, it's like a real shift of perspective.
Yes. And I think yoga, originally, was designed precisely to do that, to stop you regarding everything that you see from the prism of your own ego. As you say, do I like that? Do I want this? How might this affect me? How might it harm me? And that when you take yourself out, the yogins say, out of that, you see people in a completely different light. Now, it's natural for us as human beings that when we came out of the caves, we've got to look out for our own interests. We've got to, this is for survival. But if we can step outside it, achieve an ecstasy outside that, I think the axial sages were all discovering that you enter, you see things differently, and they become perhaps even what we'd say numinous.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess this does get back to my question of whether the divine is real, or whether there's a transcendent perspective kind of out there that we can strive for. The sense during these experiences is that, yes, there is, I have attained a higher truth at that moment. That is truer than my normal way of existing. And it's kind of out there, and even it is not the truest perspective. I could, in principle, do better than that even.
I think that what many people are really trying to do is to make that experience constant. And
that's what meditation is about.
Meditation, but they would say to follow it up with compassionate action. That therefore to treat, as you say, that they're like you. This is at the bedrock of all these religious disciplines is the golden rule. Don't do to others what you would not have done to you. And I think if we lived by that, day by day, moment by moment, if every time we were tempted to say something vile about an annoying colleague or sibling or an ex-wife or people with whom we're at war, and refrained, in that moment we would have gone beyond ourselves and achieved an ecstasis. And I think that what these great sages, the Buddha, Confucius, the great Taoists, were trying to do was to make that those intimations of holiness constant in your life, and by incarnating it in your normal behavior. And this, after all, is very much what Jesus was doing, what the rabbis were doing, and eventually what Muhammad was trying to teach people to do.
Yeah, and I guess, and I'll leave this alone and move on to another subject after this, but I guess in a way I'm suggesting that for a lot of people anyway, a big question would be, is this perspective truer in some absolute sense than your normal perspective? Because if it is, then that itself means you're saying that there is transcendent meaning, that there is some gauge of not just human conduct, but I don't know. Do you understand what I'm saying? It seems that that's kind of a big theological question. Is it only that this is leading to better behavior, and that's good because we want more people to be happy if you're a utilitarian, or is it that you really have achieved, in some fundamental sense, a truer perspective when you detach yourself from your own perspective?
I think you achieve a more sacred perspective, that when you leave the preoccupation with ego, that this is the way our humanity works. This is the structure of our humanity. This is the way it works. Now, I think humanity is pretty much divided, as we are between East and West, between those who do experience the divine as a being out there, like the prophets of Israel, who had an encounter with God that was almost sometimes a collision with a reality out there, something external. And many people experience the ultimate in that way. Other people experience it more as something that they evoke within themselves by means of their own effort. And who's to say one's righter than the other? And I'm sure that there are probably a lot of people in the Eastern traditions, in the Buddhist world, who long to have an encounter like a prophet with God out there, but they're stuck in this more internalized tradition, just as there are many monotheists, and we know, I'm probably one of them, and we know that there have been mystics like Meister Eckhart or Dionysius the Areopagite, the great Greek Orthodox theologian, who also experienced the divine as something within.
So you would still call yourself a monotheist?
No, I wouldn't.
Okay, you're taking that back.
Yes, I am, because I can't see the monotheism as the only way. I really can't. I think it's a fine way.
You could say you're a monist. I mean, mystics are, in a sense, have a kind of monism. They believe in an ultimate unity.
Mystic. I'm no mystic.
You're not a mystic.
No, I can't do mysticism. Mysticism is a real talent. I've studied mysticism. I respect it a great deal, but as I explained in my memoir, Spiral Staircase, I was completely unable to meditate as a nun. And for me, the paradigm of the external God to whom I could talk and relate just didn't work. I could not, and I just fell away from religion.
But you must have had, to enter the convent, I would think you must have had some strong kind of religious experience.
No, I was hoping to get one. I was hoping.
Spent 7 years trying, huh?
And nothing worked. I was a complete flop at prayer, meditation, and that was a great source of sorrow to me, because I tried. I'd go in to make my meditation every morning, and immediately my mind would go skittering off down byways of anxieties, fantasies, daydreams. I could not keep my mind on God for more than 1 minute. I have no problem with concentration in my studies or other, but on God it was no use. And that was a source of huge corrosive shame to me, because I thought it was all my fault. Basically, it was just the wrong kind of prayer, the wrong kind of meditation for me.
Well, what turned out to be the right kind?
For me, it's study. When I'm sitting at my desk and I'm reading, say, the Analects or the rabbis or the Quran or the Bible, I can sometimes get touched deeply within, little mini-seconds of transcendence and awe and wonder that take you out of yourself. Now, my Jewish colleagues tell me this is a very Jewish form of spirituality. This is the kind of spirituality that Jews experience when they study Torah and Talmud. And they don't talk to God necessarily, but in the course of intense concentration on the text, even argument about the text, they'll get moments of awe and wonder.
And at that point you feel as if you're in touch with something beyond or something absolute.
I don't even think about it. It's just a moment of awe or delight.
Okay. Well, having failed to get you to engage in one kind of God talk, let me try another thought on you that's pertinent to the desire of a lot of people to have a sense of higher purpose, to the sense that there's a reason they're here or that we're here collectively. And it has to do with the question of whether history has any purpose. My own view is that if you look at kind of patterns in history, the unfolding of history, there is reason to believe that there's some larger purpose that's hard to fathom. We can't entirely figure it out, but that there's something unfolding. There's some point to the exercise. And in your book, The Great Transformation, I saw some of the kind of evidence I would point to, which is, first of all, around the world in the first millennium BCE, you have different people coming up with fundamentally the same moral insight. You should detach yourself from a selfish perspective and extend benevolence. In some cases, they said throughout the world, which is a quite remarkable thing to say back in those days. And secondly, you attribute this to, if you ask why did this happen then, you point to material circumstances, urbanization, transition, and the urbanization ultimately comes down to technologies like writing and transportation. Well, if you believe that those things, that technological evolution has a trajectory, and that ultimately its byproducts spawn the kind of moral reflection that lead to fundamental moral truths, in your view, the most fundamental moral truth. I mean, could people plausibly take that as evidence that, maybe there's something larger unfolding here?
Yeah, there may well be. But of course, we're not able ever to get outside this. We are trapped within this perspective when we can get intimations of something beyond it. But that's because we're still in medias res, and we can't ever see the whole picture. The Chinese would say, you have to go with that flow. Don't think about it, and don't impose your own patterns on this immensely rich and complex flux, because again you're limiting it and projecting your own ego onto what's going on. And the Chinese would say, just that kind of certainty is unrealistic and immature. Just let it go, and you attain a kind of peace. Because also we are beings, we haven't really talked about this, who suffer. And we are plagued by the sense of our own mortality in ways that other animals are not, as far as we know. We are we can fall very easily into despair in a way that, say, a dog doesn't, or it doesn't agonize about the canine condition or about the plight of dogs in various parts of the world or what will happen after it dies, whereas we do. This is both our greatness and a source of danger for us, because if we lose hope, we can become lethal. And so I think we are this too is pushing us towards a sense of finding a peace. The ability, nirvana is not God, the discovery of God, is not to give yourself an anesthetic from suffering, but to enable you to live in composure and peace and humanely in the midst of the horror that we also see unfolding around us. And that's an important part of the religious quest too. We do seek some form of peace.
Okay. Well, speaking of the horror unfolding around us, I mean, this is, for somebody who's steeped in the Abrahamic faiths as you are, I mean, this is a kind of momentous point in world history where increasingly it seems we face the real threat of something that would merit the term clash of civilizations unfolding. I guess different people have different ideas about what to do about it. I mean, you're clearly very concerned about the problem. And it seems to me one thing you think is worth doing is highlighting elements of all three Abrahamic faiths that first of all they share, and that secondly are benign, right? And this is not what everybody thinks. There are people who say, you know, don't sugarcoat it, you know. I mean, as you know, in the Bible or in the Quran, it's a big menu. You can go in and find belligerent passages in both or benevolent passages. You tend to take a sympathetic view of religions generally, I would say.
Well, I used not to. I used to think that religions had done more harm than good. I think religion is very, very difficult to do well. It's like an art form. I do see religion as a kind of art form, a way of finding meaning and value, just as painting or literature, poetry does. And when not many people are able to do religion very well. There's an awful lot of bad religion around, just as there's a lot of bad cooking or bad art.
But it's more consequential in the case of religion when it's bad.
Well, I think too. I think too that in parts of the world where you're seeing some of the worst aspects of religion, you've got a society that has been engulfed in violence and corruption. The Middle East, for example, has been engaged in ongoing conflict now for 100 years or more. There's also the problem of oil, which is like a wizard's curse and has been a difficult element in the modernization of the region. But when a country is engulfed in long-term conflict, which festers on and on, this affects everything we do. It affects our relationships, our dreams, our fantasies, and it affects our religion. And I think religion has got sucked into the conflict, a whole region that has gone bad and has become a part of the problem. I don't think it's religion per se. I don't think people read the Quran and say, right now I'm going to blow up a London bus. I think they decide to blow up a London bus for all kinds of political and emotional and pseudo-religious reasons.
And they decide
yes.
which part of the Quran they'll focus on
yes.
based on the circumstances of their life.
You see, also, we're also reading our scriptures in a different way in the modern period. In the pre-modern period, and as you see from my book, people didn't even approve of written scriptures. Your scriptures were something you listened to, and that were chanted aloud. Until the modern invention of printing made it possible for everybody to own his or her own copy of the Bible, say, or the Quran, or before modern literacy and widespread literacy, an essentially modern thing. Gave them the ability to read it. People couldn't comb through their scriptures. You listened to what was read out. Often it was read out in a foreign language. And you had an entirely different relationship with your scripture. You couldn't just comb through the Quran and pick out the bits on jihad and leave the bits that speak of friendship and compassion outside. You had to take the whole package more. And I think that people are reading their scriptures in a quite different way. And that has good aspects because we can know our scriptures more thoroughly. But people, especially when in what we call the fundamentalist movements, where people feel under threat, people tend to concentrate on those belligerent aspects. You get Christians in the United States, for example, who quote heavily from the book of Revelation, but rarely quote the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, turn the other cheek, don't retaliate.
Well, and when he says love your enemy, that's
yes.
something you don't hear very often.
You don't.
These days. But am I right in thinking that, and as I think you agreed, you try to paint a fairly sympathetic portrait of the religions. You don't ignore the warts, but you're not preoccupied by them. I'd compare you to Houston Smith in a way in terms of your, another great scholar of world religions. Am I right in thinking that both you and Houston Smith, though, in a way have to work a little harder with the Abrahamic tradition to paint the sympathetic portrait? I guess what I mean is it's kind of what I mean. Sometimes in the Eastern traditions, in Buddhism, and say somebody like Moti, if that's the way you pronounce it, in China, an extreme view of benevolence, an identification with all human beings or all living is very explicitly laid out and uncompromisingly laid out, and is put explicitly at the core of a philosophy. Whereas with the Abrahamic scriptures, it's more like plucking these things from...
Yes, you're right there. And in my own defense, I have written a whole book on fundamentalism, which includes all these acts of terror and violence. And I wrote an early book of mine was about the Crusades, which is an extremely grim chapter in Christian history. So I have looked at that dark side. In fact, I wrote A History of God rather to cheer myself up after my book on the Crusades, because that was really a difficult project, living with this religiously inspired hatred. But yes, you're right. There are these passages in Scripture which are there for people who want to pick them up. But I'll just tell you an interesting story. I was informed by the police some time ago that a young man had read my biography of the Buddha, and on an aeroplane, and he showed me the markings, and he was a disturbed young man, killed both his parents, and then killed himself.
That's what he took away from the Buddha.
Yeah. Now, of all my books, Buddha, who is non-violent, full of compassion, as far as we know. I mean, certainly, if that young man could extract that, and I saw he'd written "Dad" down the margins. Yeah. This is, someone said, thank goodness he didn't pick up a copy of the Bible, or there might have been a wholesale massacre. But it's very much what you bring to your scriptures, and of course there are, I think, a very good exercise that Jews, Christians, and Muslims could all do is let's take a good, long, hard look at these difficult passages of our scriptures, see what the original context was, where they came from, what I've tried to do that a bit in this book, for example, and what produced them, how are we to evaluate them, given the fact that they can be exploited by disturbed, enraged, immoral people from time to time. But the potential for human misinterpretation of texts is extraordinary, as I found in that peculiar instance.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I could almost see the suicide part if it was for a worthy cause. I mean, there's such a... Buddhist monks set themselves on fire to protest the Vietnam War, for example.
But you don't take other people with you.
No, exactly. That's the part.
That's the point,
where
yes.
he clearly wasn't getting the picture. And I guess, in terms of the current predicament of the world, another question is how do you reach the fundamentalists? I mean, you and I don't have much credibility with them. You know, I went to the Parliament of the World's Religions in Barcelona.
Me too.
And I thought how wonderful it is that, you know, all these people are here in this ecumenical spirit and they have exactly the right philosophy. And then I thought, and they're exactly the people who don't need to be here. You know, they were fine before they came here. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do, because it preoccupies and worries me a great deal. I think, you know, we live in our own circles. They live in their circle. We live in ours. Occasionally there's a collision. And that occurred once when I was at a conference in Oregon, where there we all called God at 2000, 7 of us, a rabbi, an imam, me. We were all talking about God and how all the religions had no, you know, equal validity. And finally, a fundamentalist erupted in the hall and started to scream at us when we were all on stage that Jews and Muslims had rejected Jesus, so they were going to hell, and we who connived at this were also going to hell. And eventually he was hustled out. But there was a complete failure. My point is, I could hear the note of pain in his voice, that we had assaulted him in some way at a profound level. But also we 7 of us who were articulate people had been talking non-stop for 2.5 days, were utterly silenced by him. Faced with this onslaught, we couldn't respond. We gazed at each other over a huge gulf of incomprehension. Now that's happening in several parts of the world. It's happening here in the States, which is pretty evenly divided but religiously between, say, fundamentalists and, as it were, liberal. In the Middle East, you have it between secularists, people, Western-educated people, and the religious. It's in Israel where there's a profound divide between religious and secularist Israelis. And this is very dangerous, that we're living in societies where people literally cannot speak to one another, where we literally don't share the same language. I think one thing that what I think we can do is to try to understand what lies at the base of the of the rhetoric and the ideology, to try to decode some of these theologies and see the pain and the fear and the anger and the humiliation that lies at their root. Not just dismiss them, or that, you know, that they're a bunch of loonies. This is not respectful. It's not compassionate. That's the first step. Perhaps learn to listen.
And this is one of the hardest things for people to do, and it gets back to a theme we've touched on repeatedly, but to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's, first of all, in circumstances very different from yours, and really appreciate the way life looks from their point of view. And secondly, somebody who hates you, right? Somebody who is professed a desire to wipe out your civilization, say, for example. I mean, that carries self-transcendence almost to a new level.
Yeah. But first of all, though, we have to practice with people nearer home. Before we can take on Osama bin Laden or the fundamentalists in this country who would like to blow up the federal buildings, we have to start practicing on people we dislike, or people we feel we are in our own offices, in our own families, among our own friends, because we're not going to be able to make this giant leap at once. That's what but also this is what they all say. Moti, as you pointed out, said concern for everybody. Jesus was equally uncompromising in the Sermon on the Mount. Don't just love those who love you. Love your enemies. And love, of course, as I've tried to point out in the book, it's not intended that you're filled with warm, generous affection. We're not talking about emotions here when the priestly author says, love the stranger, love your neighbor as yourself. This was a legal term used in international treaties. It means you give practical support and informed help and loyalty. That we can do. We can look at the circumstances where some of our enemies are living see what is going wrong in these regions, and try, with the great power of the West, with our great wealth, to try to rectify some of these imbalances in the world and defuse. We can't do anything, perhaps, about the people who've gone completely over to the terrorist camp.
Right. Osama bin Laden is
we can't hope
beyond
to
conversion, right?
Well, who knows?
You're an optimistic person.
I'm not an optimist, but I think the big task is to prevent many people who are disaffected and worried about the West from going over to that camp.
Right.
The extremists still represent a tiny minority. Let's keep it that way, and we can do so best by rectifying some of the clear disorders in the region, not by going in with all guns blazing, because we know from history that when you attack these movements, they become more extreme. Many of these fundamentalist movements, be they Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, are all rooted in a profound fear of annihilation. They all believe that modern liberal secular society wants to wipe out faith. So if you attack them, this confirms them in their suspicion.
It's almost a shame that they can't appreciate how much they have in common at an abstract level.
That's right.
It could be
and very often you hear them talking about this in the same language, from two camps, one good, one evil. You're either with me or against me, this kind of thing. That this is a polarized mindset, and they have a great deal in common indeed.
Well, even in America, I've often thought in political terms, evangelicals and Muslims who live in America actually have a certain amount in common, probably, in terms of the way they view, say, public school curriculum and things they don't like, things that they think are, but they don't get together and talk about it as a practical political matter. Now, in The Great Transformation, you don't talk explicitly much about kind of science and religion. And yet, as I said, you do seem to be focusing on thinkers who provided a spiritual vocabulary that could be viable in a scientific age. Is this? I mean, do you worry about the corrosive effect of science or on people's belief in spirituality? On people, I mean, you're not a very theistic person, but I mean, on the ability of people to have spiritual guidance.
I don't. I'm probably not the best person to ask about this because I have no head for science. I can't do it very well. I'm no good at mathematics, that kind of thing. But I see science and religion as doing two entirely different jobs. That science cannot, and any scientist will tell you, give you meaning. Science, it tells you what is. It cannot give you the answer to the meaning of life. Similarly, religion can't cure cancer, or it can't get a spaceship onto Mars. This is like art. It's part of the mythos. It's part of the way our imaginative minds work that helps us to live in this drastic world. And science, I think, has done huge benefit. It's given huge benefits to humanity. But of course, like everything, we're not always very good at keeping it in check. We have created weapons that can wipe out the planet. We're destroying the planet environmentally, but I am not at all worried about its effect on people's belief in God. I don't think the author of Genesis had in any sense giving a description of how life came into being. Cosmologies in the ancient world were therapeutic. They were designed to give people a sort of a hope of something new. You'd read a cosmogony at somebody's sickbed or deathbed, or if you were building a new boat, or in a sense, or if you were in trauma, as the when the first chapter of Genesis was created, the people of Israel were in exile in Babylonia. They'd lost their homeland. They'd lost their world. And you have this cosmogony, a wonderful, confident cosmogony, which says that everything is good, that God blesses everything, and that God is, even though their God has been defeated apparently by the gods of Babylonia, he's far more powerful than the local gods. A very therapeutic cosmogony. And I think we're reading our scriptures as though they were factual. This makes belief very difficult in a scientific age, but that's many people find it difficult now to think mythically.
To think mythically, which you applaud. I mean, I mean, you applaud thinking mythically. I mean,
yes.
You have nothing wrong, no problem with people who think mythically.
No, I think we are myth makers. Human beings are myth makers. We have evolved myths that don't give us factual information about the world, but which help us to live in it. And the myths are programs for action, for example. The myth of the hero tells you how to unlock the heroic potential within yourself. And unless you act upon the myth of the hero, you won't see its truth. And the religions are like that. The religions, and certainly the religions that I've described in The Great Transformation, are programs for action. And you recognize their truth for humanity when you put these precepts into action in your own life and discover that they work. They give you an enhanced spirituality. But some of these people, the Buddha was very empirical. Test out all my teaching, monks. Don't take anything on faith. Don't take anything at second hand. If you don't like my teaching and it doesn't chime with your experience, leave it. Mm-hmm. Find something else. Test everything out. That's something that I think people in our empirical world can relate to. Mm-hmm. Instead of having truths dished out from above, something that most of these axial sages would have abhorred.
Okay. So, I mean, as far as science, although, I mean, you I don't think would describe yourself as a very theistic person.
No, I haven't found... I think the concept of God has been a wonderful concept. But then there are, I suppose I go for theism where it shades off and becomes very close to Buddhism. When I wrote History of God, I traced how in all three of the monotheisms you have this sort of mystical sense.
So when you said you are not a successful mystic, you didn't mean that you don't find the mystical conception of the divine appealing.
Oh, no.
Intellectually, it's just that you're not good at reaching nirvana.
I can't do it myself. But I'm rather like someone, say, who's gone to ballet school and done all the training but doesn't finally make it into the company or doesn't make ballerina. But when I look at dancing, because I've studied ballet, I appreciate what those dancers are doing, and so I have a huge appreciation for the mystical. And I think that the mystics are the stars of the spiritual life. They're like Vladimir Ashkenazi, as opposed to the other people who just strum away on the piano. But we can get a great deal out of listening to these stars and also learn about their attitudes. What the mystics tell us is, don't try to be too explicit about God. Look for the divine within yourself, that it's practice, not theology or metaphysics or doctrine that's important. Mm-hmm. And that so I think, and indeed, many of the mystics see all the great religions as one. As the Sufis, for example, in the mystics of Islam, make it quite clear that once you've glimpsed the divine, you're neither a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim. You've left these man-made distinctions behind. There's one mystic Ibn Arabi, a 12th century Muslim mystic, who wrote a wonderful thing that I found very early in my studies. Do not praise your own faith exclusively so that you may disbelieve all the rest. If you do this, you will miss the whole truth of the matter. God, the omniscient, omnipotent, cannot be confined to any one creed, for he says in the Quran, wheresoever ye turn, there is the face of Allah. Everybody praises what he knows. His God is his own creature, and in praising it, he praises himself, which he would not do if he were just, but his dislike is based on ignorance. And I think I haven't been where Ibn Arabi has been spiritually, but I think once that I've learnt from his empathic appreciation of other faiths to look for wisdom in the other traditions instead of seeing them in competition with my own.
Mm-hmm. And I think what you're saying is one reason I tend to think of mysticism as kind of compatible with the scientific age. You know, when the idea of a highly anthropomorphic God reaching down, throwing down bolts of lightning seems less credible once you understand how lightning works, for example. So you would agree that mysticism is well suited to a scientific age? I
do, and I think that if you can follow it, some of the physicists out there, or the cosmologists, are evolving a new kind of religious discourse. They're pitting you, like the mystics, against the dark world of uncreated reality. They're showing us how, you know, with our best endeavors, we cannot have a clear, simplistic view of how the world came into being. That we are, they talk in mythical terms about black holes and big bangs. And they're showing if you can follow it, it can give people intimations of awe and wonder and absolute mystery and transcendence.
And have you ever had something you would call a mystical experience?
No, as I say, for me, the closest I come to it is in my study or listening to music or learning to appreciate other people. I think moments of I've experienced of kindness have sometimes given me moments of ecstasis, memories of certain people who've been iconic in my life, showing me a sort of compassion, have been an inspiration, I think.
So it can be transcended to be on the receiving end of compassion well as the giving.
What was great about in the Chinese tradition, they had a very, very strong ritual laws that governed people's behavior. And it was these rituals of politeness not only helped to design to transform the person who performed them, but by giving this attention and respect to the other, you enhance the holiness of the other person. And I think that was a profound psychological insight, because when you treat people as though they have absolute value, they respond. They begin to feel what they might not have experienced before, that yes, they are valuable, that they are holy, they are sacred and inviolable. And I think that the compassionate acts can give people that sense of their own sanctity.
Okay. You said that there was a period in your life, I mean, I heard this in an interview, when you called yourself a freelance monotheist, and you said you, at that point, derived nutrition from all three Abrahamic faiths. Did you mean that there was something distinctive that each one gave you? I mean, yes. Could you go through them?
Yes.
And say what it is that, I mean, what does Islam bring to the table, for example, that you don't find so strongly in Christianity and Judaism?
Yes, I can. For Islam, it's the pluralism. It is the Quran is a very pluralistic document. It has in a way that you don't have in the Jewish and Christian scriptures, a strong teaching that all rightly guided religion comes from God, that God has spoken to every people on the face of the earth in their own language, and that that Muslims are to regard themselves as one with the Christians and Jews and the people of the book. And today Muslim scholars say that had Muhammad known about the Hindus and the Buddhists, or even the Native Americans or the Australian Aborigines, he'd have praised their religious leaders too, because all rightly guided, that religion that leads to justice and compassionate behavior must come from the mysterious source that we call Allah. In Judaism, what intrigued me was its constant questioning, never taking no for an answer. The way in the Talmud the rabbis keep arguing with one another, on and on and on over the centuries. And after coming on my Catholic background, I found that where you know there were infallible statements and you had to believe thus. I found it very sort of liberating that this constant questioning, that constant interrogating of a text, a sense that the point of reading the Bible was constant interpretation of it, not that you just had to take what was given.
And what about Christianity?
I think Christianity has been luminous at its best in its stress, in the stress on compassion. That I like the idea that by talking about Jesus as somehow divine, that you are saying that divine and human are inseparable, that you can't think God without thinking human, and you can't think of human without thinking God. And when you look at Jesus, as he's presented in the Gospels, you have an idea this might be how God would be if we could conceive him in human form, going out to people who are normally despised, going out not to the good guys, not to the respectable guys, but to the people who are beyond the pale, to the sinners. And we should think that when we have Christians, you don't often follow that. They are often very quick to condemn sinners in their own society, or sinners in nations who are sinners or evildoers, etc. And I think that is a great the story of Jesus as the Word of God, but the Word of God that practices Jan I, concern for everybody.
And he explicitly says that what you do to the least fortunate, you've done to me. In other words,
yes,
he's explicitly saying what you said, which is that the human is divine.
And that this comes from the parable of the sheep and the goats, when the king invites into the kingdom those who have visited the poor and sick and people in prison and given food to the hungry. And those who haven't done it don't get into the kingdom or into the presence of God. But they come into the presence of God not because of their beliefs or because they've adopted the correct sexual ethics, but because they have practiced practical compassion and have given to people people in prison who are not normally the most edifying of souls, that absolute respect that has given them access to what we call God.
Okay. And finally, there's in the Bhagavad Gita, in your book, in The Great Transformation, you focus on this passage where it says that you should be devoted to action and indifferent to the fruits of action. In other words, indifferent to the praise or blame that right action may incur in a given social setting, right?
I think it's more than that. The Bhagavad Gita was addressing a real problem that had arisen during the Indian axial age. There was no possibility of achieving enlightenment if you behaved violently. Non-violence was absolutely crucial and cardinal to every spirituality. Before you could do a single yoga exercise, you had to adopt an attitude of perpetual serenity, so that you did not even speak a cross word to other people or swat an insect. Mm-hmm. Now, there was a whole warrior caste who were therefore excluded. Their sacred duty was to defend society and to fight, if necessary, and they felt excluded. The Bhagavad Gita is an attempt to say, yes, look, you can be enlightened too, but be indifferent to the fruit. You have to be indifferent to the fruits of action. Not, if you go to war, you must not expect to get anything from it yourself. It's not that you're just worried about pain or blame, you must not expect political kudos, you mustn't expect economic gain, you mustn't expect anything for yourself. Only then can you engage in warfare. Now that demands a degree of selflessness that in the Indian terminology can only be achieved by yoga, by the immense onslaught of egotism that is achieved by the yogic exercises.
And has this been an issue for you at all? And what I mean by that is you know, once you're a best-selling author, there are fruits of your action that are economic, and suddenly there are a lot of directions you can go in, and some will get you one kind of reward, some will get you another kind of reward. Has it been, have you had to resist, has it been a challenge coping with this kind of success?
Well, I've been so busy, frankly, that I haven't had much time to, I don't have a yacht or anything of that sort, or I actually live quite a frugal life. I live alone. I generally eat sandwiches and baked beans. I don't cook. When I take people out for dinners and that kind of thing, but I don't have jewels or anything of that sort. And I'm so busy. I'm either writing or else I'm being asked to go round and lecture to people about fundamentalism and Islam, and that seems to be a sort of public service. That's something that I do not because I'm being paid for it, but because I think it's important that in this very dangerous time we speak about these things. So I'm really so busy that I don't have much time to enjoy the fruits of action. I've been glad of the money. I've been able to look after my mother, who just died last week.
I'm sorry.
But it was her time was up, but she had no money, so I was able to make sure that she was looked after, that there was somebody with her, something I couldn't have done beforehand. And now I have to think of another good way to use the money.
Well, I mean, you seem to be spending your time fairly wisely. I do want to come back to what I said at first, though. I said, in a certain sense, this is a kind of a gospel message in the sense of the meaning of the word gospel. It's good news you bring, and timely news, and also in the sense that it's a kind of a message of salvation in some sense of the word, not in terms of how to get your soul to heaven, no, but in some other sense, right?
Yes, I think it's a recipe for what we must do in the world. The people, Buddha, Socrates, Jeremiah, Confucius, Lao Tzu, they were all operating at a time when individualism was beginning to surface. When people were beginning for the first time to see themselves as autonomous individuals, as opposed to having a group identity where the tribe, the group was more important than the individual. Today, we live in a society of rampant individualism, but we're also living in a global society where we've got to learn to practice the golden rule globally, treating other nations, other peoples as though they were as important as our own. And I think it's time, in this time of hatred, there's so much hatred in the world, so much righteous condemnation of other people, for us to delve down through the rubble that has accumulated in all these world traditions over the centuries, to the core of compassion and non-violence that lies at the root of all these great traditions. These traditions, especially Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have all been implicated and tarnished recently by violent action, even by violent speech and hatred. I think that the world needs religion to keep compassion, which is not a very popular virtue. As I say, people prefer a sense of righteousness to a sense of perpetual kindness. We need religion to help us to do that. And I think this is the time to go beneath the violence, the righteousness, the triumphalism, and to learn about reacquaint ourselves with the golden rule, with the hatred of violence and oppression, the desire for justice that lies at the heart of all these great traditions.
And am I right in thinking there's some continuity between your motivation to convey this message and what got you into a convent in the first place?
I often think that I've come full circle. I am still a kind of nun in some ways. I mean, I've never married, and I live alone, and I spend my days writing and talking and thinking about God and spirituality. And this may have been the kind of life I was looking for when I joined a convent all those years ago. For years after I left the convent, I wanted nothing to do with religion. I was just exhausted by it. But it has been the study of other traditions that has taught me what my own religious tradition was trying to do at its best, and has reacquainted me with the value of seeking the sacred in every aspect of your life.
Okay, and one final attempt to get you to phrase your spirituality in more theistic terms. I'm sure it's going to fail, but I have to ask this question. I heard you on an interview. This was an interview in which they were kind of pressing you to flesh out your belief, and you said, "Well, I don't like the word belief," and so on. And it became clear you're not kind of a theist. You no longer have this idea of a God up there directing things for you. But later in the interview, when you were talking about the fact that you had wound up not marrying and living alone, and for that reason being very productive, you said, so maybe it was meant to be. Now, who would have meant it? Or what would have meant it? Or was that just a casual...
I think it was more I don't see somebody up there manipulating me into this. But I often think that my life has gone in strange patterns, that things I thought I wanted very much, I failed at, and that has ultimately been a good thing. But that may be the way things are, that we are so filled with delusion. We pit ourselves into the wrong paths, we go after the wrong people, and life is a learning process. I don't think it was meant that it was foreordained, or that God is up there tweaking the strings. But that maybe there is, and I'm sort of thinking this through as I speak, maybe this is the way that life is so structured that it takes trial and error to find how to express that deep inner core that makes each one of us sacred, holy, and divine. And it's not easy to find how to do it. And that maybe it's part of almost a sort of spiritual DNA. You've got to somehow find a way to live that out. And that's probably what is meant to be. In order to be the person that perhaps I should be, I had to make all those mistakes. And because they made what I have now much richer, but it's a perpetual quest, and it's never finished. I hope on my deathbed I'll still be looking for something until my mind gives out.
Okay, well, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
But thanks so much.
Thank you.
This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.